When nations face their darkest hours, they all reach for the same forbidden solution. It doesn't matter whether they're ancient empires or modern superpowers, or whether they're ruled by kings, presidents, or dictators. When the walls start closing in, when debts pile up, and when wars demand financing, they all make the same fatal decision. They fire up the money presses, and every time the result is catastrophic. It always looks like a temporary fix, and it always seems manageable until it isn't. Tonight we're diving into 3 historical moments where entire civilizations believed they could outmaneuver reality by expanding the money supply at will. What you're about to witness isn't just ancient history. It's a blueprint of destruction that keeps repeating, and the warning signals are flashing brighter than ever. The pattern is always identical. First comes the crisis: political unrest, economic collapse, and war. The government needs money, but the treasury is empty. Raising taxes triggers rebellion, and borrowing has limits. So they discover what looks like magic: issuing more currency and creating purchasing power on demand. Problem solved? Wrong. Because money doesn't create value. It only redistributes it, and almost always in the worst possible way. Prices explode, savings evaporate, and society fractures. Empires that once ruled the world crumble into dust, and the money they thought would save them becomes the poison that kills them. Every leader who walks this road believes they're different. They think their situation is unique, their economists are smarter, and their system is stronger. They watch other nations collapse and tell themselves that could never happen here until it does. We're going to examine 3 civilizations that learned this lesson the hard way. Ancient Rome, where emperors discovered they could dilute silver coins to finance endless wars. Weimar Germany, where a desperate government printed marks by the billions to pay impossible debts. Modern Zimbabwe, where leaders turned a once prosperous nation into an economic wasteland in less than a decade. But this isn't just about the past. The same forces are operating today, and the stakes have never been higher. Because when the next collapse arrives, it won't be confined to a single empire or nation. It will spread across the entire globe, and understanding this pattern isn't optional. Because when money fails, everything else follows. Rome didn't fall because of barbarian invasions or political corruption. Those were symptoms. The real killer was hiding in plain sight in every coin that changed hands across the empire. For centuries, the economic backbone of Rome was the denarius, a silver coin so trusted that merchants from Britannia to Egypt accepted it without question. Nearly pure silver, precisely minted and backed by the full faith of the most powerful empire on earth. Roman soldiers earned their pay, and merchants stored their wealth in them. Citizens saved for retirement by keeping jars filled with shining silver. But running an empire costs money, massive amounts of money. Legions stationed on distant frontiers demanded regular pay. Roads, aqueducts, and forums required constant maintenance. And Rome was always at war somewhere: Germania, Parthia, Britannia, and rebellions in Gaul. Every campaign drained the treasury. By the 2nd century, the math was becoming impossible. Tax revenues couldn't keep pace with military spending. Citizens were already stretched to the limit, and raising taxes further risked revolt. Borrowing had limits in a world without central banks or modern bond markets. So the emperors discovered what they thought was genius. Instead of admitting they were broke, they quietly reduced the silver content in each denarius. Not enough for people to notice right away, but enough to stretch their precious metal reserves. They could mint more coins using the same amount of silver. More coins meant more spending power for the government. Crisis solved. The numbers tell the story of this catastrophe in slow motion. Under Augustus, the denarius contained 95% pure silver. Citizens could bite the coin and taste the metal. They could feel its weight in their hands. It was real wealth you could hold. But each successive emperor shaved off a little more. By the early 3rd century, under Emperor Caracalla, the silver content had fallen to 50%. The coin still looked the same and still carried the imperial stamp, but half the value had vanished into thin air. Then the slide accelerated. By the reign of Gallienus, the denarius contained less than 5% silver. What had once been a solid silver coin was now bronze with a thin silver wash. Citizens could scratch the surface and watch the silver peel away. People aren't stupid. They could see what was happening. The coins felt lighter. Merchants began weighing them and rejecting the obviously debased ones. Inflation followed like a shadow. Prices rose because the money itself was becoming worthless. A measure of wheat that once cost 1 denarius suddenly required 10. This wasn't abstract economic theory. It was families watching their savings disappear. Soldiers discovered their pay couldn't buy food. Merchants abandoned Roman currency entirely. The more trust eroded, the more desperately the emperors debased the coin. They needed volume to replace value. If each coin was worth less, they would mint more coins. Local economies fell back into barter. Farmers traded grain directly for tools. The sophisticated monetary system that had bound the empire together was breaking into primitive exchanges. Roman civilization was literally being dismantled, one debased coin at a time. But the real catastrophe was still ahead. Because when your money becomes worthless, everything else starts to come apart too. Soldiers couldn't be paid, so they mutinied or switched sides. Tax collectors found their revenues worthless before they could deliver them to Rome. Provincial governors discovered they were ruling territories that contributed nothing to imperial finances. The crisis peaked during what historians call the crisis of the 3rd century. Between 235 and 284 AD, the empire endured 50 years of chaos. Nearly 50 emperors rose and fell. Plagues swept through the provinces and barbarian tribes pressed the borders. Civil wars erupted as generals fought for control. Behind all the political drama was a simple truth: the money was broken, so everything else broke too. You can't run an empire with worthless coins any more than you can build a house on quicksand. The foundation had rotted and the structure was already collapsing. Emperor Diocletian tried to stop the bleeding with price controls. In 301 AD, he issued the Edict on Maximum Prices. The edict was a disaster. You can't decree that worthless money has value. The black market exploded and official trade collapsed. People learned that the law couldn't make broken money whole. Eventually, Rome abandoned the denarius entirely and introduced the gold solidus under Constantine. But by then the damage was irreversible. The Western Empire was hollow and held up only by the memory of past greatness. This is the first lesson history teaches us about printing money. It always begins with a crisis that seems to justify extraordinary measures. It always begins with leaders who believe they can manage the process and avoid the fate of their predecessors. And it always ends the same way. Rome's collapse should have been a warning echoing through history. Instead, it became a playbook that every desperate government eventually follows. Rome didn't collapse overnight. It collapsed slowly while its coins still seemed to be the same. Fast forward 16 centuries to a Germany defeated in 1918 and watch the pattern repeat with terrifying precision. The Treaty of Versailles didn't just end World War I. It sentenced Germany to financial death. The Allied powers demanded reparations so massive they defied comprehension, 132 billion gold marks equivalent to roughly $400 billion today. To put that in perspective, it was more than Germany's entire gross domestic product. The victors wanted Germany to pay for the entire war plus interest over the next 60 years. The German government faced an impossible choice. They could refuse to pay and face military occupation by French and British forces. They could raise taxes to levels that would trigger revolution. They could borrow money they had no hope of repaying. Or they could do what governments always do when they're cornered: they could print their way out of the problem. At first it seemed reasonable. The Reichsbank began issuing new marks to meet reparation payments. Only temporary measures, they assured the public, just enough to get through the crisis. The presses started slowly and cautiously. A few billion marks here and a few billion there. Nothing they couldn't handle. But debt has its own gravity. Once you start printing money to pay obligations, you can never print enough. Every payment required more marks. Every new batch of currency made the existing money less valuable. And as the mark weakened, Germany needed even more of them to buy the gold and foreign currency the Allies demanded. By 1922, the presses were running day and night. The Reichsbank employed entire shifts of workers just to operate the machines producing new money. Printing companies across Germany were contracted to help with the workload. The government was literally manufacturing currency faster than they could count it. The numbers became surreal. In January 1922, one US dollar bought 300 German marks. By July it bought 800. By December it bought 7,000. The mark wasn't just falling. It was in free fall, accelerating toward oblivion. Workers began demanding pay twice a day because their morning wages were worth nothing by afternoon. Restaurants changed their menus every hour as food costs spiked. Merchants stopped printing new price tags and simply wrote numbers on chalkboards, erasing and updating them all day long. But the real madness was still to come. In 1923, hyperinflation reached levels that sound like fiction. Prices didn't just rise, they exploded exponentially. A loaf of bread that cost 1 mark in 1919 cost 12 marks in 1921. By mid-1923, that same loaf cost more than 3,000 marks. By September it cost 2 million marks. By November it cost more than 200 billion marks. People needed wheelbarrows to carry enough cash for basic purchases. Children played with piles of worthless bills because they were more plentiful than toys. People wallpapered their homes with currency because it was cheaper than buying real wallpaper. The German mark had become a cruel joke and a symbol of national humiliation printed on paper that grew more useless by the day. The human cost was devastating. Lifetime savings built over decades vanished overnight. Retirees who had worked their whole lives found themselves destitute. The middle class, the backbone of German society, was wiped out. Their bank accounts and insurance policies and government bonds became meaningless numbers on worthless paper. Meanwhile, those who understood what was happening protected themselves. The wealthy converted marks into foreign currency or gold or real estate. Factory owners paid off debts with worthless paper and emerged from hyperinflation debt-free and rich in assets. International speculators bought German companies for the price of a meal. This created a brutal transfer of wealth from savers to debtors and from the middle class to the elite and from ordinary Germans to foreign investors. Hyperinflation didn't just destroy money, it destroyed the social fabric that held the nation together. Trust evaporated. Traditional values collapsed. The promise that hard work and saving would be rewarded became a lie everyone could see. Political extremism filled the vacuum left by economic collapse. When people lose everything they worked for and when their government destroys their savings through monetary manipulation, they become desperate for someone to blame. They become willing to listen to radical solutions from radical leaders. Nazi Party membership surged during the hyperinflation crisis. Adolf Hitler's attempted coup in Munich took place in November 1923, exactly at the peak of the monetary collapse. It failed, but the seeds were planted. When people's money becomes worthless, they start looking for scapegoats and strongmen. Democracy becomes a luxury they feel they can no longer afford. Germany eventually stabilized by introducing a new currency backed by land and gold. Hyperinflation ended as suddenly as it began, but the damage was permanent. An entire generation had learned that governments lie about money and that savings are fragile and that democracy offers no protection against financial destruction. That lesson would echo in German politics for decades. It would influence their response to the next crisis in the 1930s. It would shape their approach to monetary policy after World War II. The trauma of watching money become meaningless doesn't fade quickly. It embeds itself in the national psyche, a scar that never fully heals. And yet somehow the world didn't learn from Germany's agony. The same mistake would be repeated again and again in different countries in different decades in different circumstances. Because when crisis hits and when governments face impossible choices, the temptation to print money becomes irresistible. The third act of our monetary tragedy doesn't take place in ancient Rome or war-torn Europe but in modern Africa. Zimbabwe in the year 2000 was a functioning nation with a stable currency, productive agriculture, and a growing economy. 20 years later, it had become synonymous with hyperinflation so extreme that children used trillion-dollar bills as play money. This wasn't ancient history or wartime desperation. This was the 21st century, with all our supposed understanding of economics and monetary policy. And yet Zimbabwe managed to destroy its currency so completely that the government eventually abandoned it entirely, adopting foreign currencies just to function. The collapse began with land redistribution policies that decimated agricultural output. Zimbabwe had been the breadbasket of southern Africa, exporting food across the continent. But political decisions destroyed the agricultural sector almost overnight. Food production plunged. Export revenues vanished. The government found itself facing budget deficits that grew every month. Sound familiar? crisis, empty treasury, and desperate government. The same setup that destroyed Roman Germany was playing out again. And once again, leaders convinced themselves they were different, that their situation was unique, that printing money would solve their problems instead of creating new ones. President Robert Mugabe's government began printing Zimbabwe dollars to cover budget deficits. At first, the amounts seemed manageable. A few billion here, a few billion there. Just enough to keep government services running, pay public employees, and maintain the appearance of a functioning state. But printing money to cover deficits is like drinking seawater to cure thirst. It offers temporary relief while worsening the underlying problem. Each new batch of currency diluted the value of the existing money. As prices rose, the government needed even more money to buy the same goods and services. The presses accelerated. By 2003, inflation had reached triple digits. By 2006, it exceeded 1,000% annually. By 2008, Zimbabwe was experiencing hyperinflation so severe that economists struggled to measure it accurately. The official inflation rate reached an incomprehensible 89 sextillion%. That's a number with 21 zeros. People needed suitcases to carry enough cash for bread. The $100 trillion Zimbabwe note became a global curiosity, a symbol of total monetary collapse. The currency died so completely that the government abandoned it in 2009, adopting the US dollar, the South African rand, and other foreign currencies. Zimbabwe in the 21st century, with computers, modern economists, and access to the entire financial history of the world, managed to repeat the exact same mistakes as Rome and Germany. Not because they didn't know better, but because political pressure and immediate needs made printing money seem like the only option left. The pattern has returned. The pattern never changes, only the names and the dates. Rome's emperors thought they could stretch silver forever. German politicians believed they could print their way out of Versailles. Zimbabwe's leaders convinced themselves they were building a new economy. Each time, the story ends the same: money dies, people suffer, and empires crumble into dust. What makes this terrifying today is the scale. Rome's collapse was regional. Germany's hyperinflation was national. Zimbabwe's disaster was local. But now we live in a world where every major economy runs on paper currencies backed by nothing but promises. Central banks coordinate money creation. Debts are measured in trillions, not millions. When the next monetary collapse comes, it won't be confined to one empire or one continent. It will be global. The warning signals are blinking everywhere: governments creating trillions during every crisis, debt levels that would have horrified previous generations, and inflation creeping back after decades of stability. The same desperation, the same justifications, and the same belief that this time is different. History doesn't repeat, but if you ignore its lessons, it will crush you anyway. The empires we examine tonight made the same fatal mistake. They confused paper with wealth, promises with value, and printing with prosperity. And each one paid the ultimate price. The question isn't whether the next monetary collapse will happen. The question is whether you'll be ready when it does. The danger isn't inflation. The danger is believing money can replace real value, productivity, and trust.